各位，现在已经进入到我们 webinar 的观众朋友们，大家晚上好。如果你是在都柏林的话呢，就是中午好。首先自我介绍一下，我是黄杰，是都柏林大学全球中心市场推广以及呢校友关系的维护负责人。非常高兴欢迎大家参加今天的布鲁姆日的特别活动，解读尤利西斯。那今天的活动呢，是本年度我们 UCD Festival 的收官之作、收官活动。那么今天其实对于我们都柏林大学的校友，或者呢对于即将要入学都柏林大学的同学们来讲呢，其实都是意义非凡的一天。那今天呢，6月16号呢是布鲁姆日，那这个节日呢也是为了纪念我们最知名的校友詹姆斯·乔伊斯的文学杰作《尤利西斯》呢的一个节日。那并且呢，2022年今年呢是恰逢这个《尤利西斯》出版100周年的这么一个纪念的年份，所以呢，我们非常高兴能够借此机会向更多的读者、更多的书迷朋友们介绍我们的校友詹姆斯·乔伊斯的杰作《尤利西斯》。那么今天呢，我们非常荣幸邀请到了2位嘉宾加入到了我们本年度的这个布鲁姆日的特别活动。那第一位呢，大家在这个现在视频上已经可以看到了，是我们邀请到了爱尔兰非常知名的作家、制作人Robert Gogan 先生。那他本人呢是这个詹姆斯·乔伊斯非常狂热的书迷，那将会呢在接下来的活动当中呢向大家展示如何能够更好的阅读尤利西斯。Hi Robert, you say hello
how are you,
to our friends.
How are you? We are very good and fine here in Ireland at 1:15 midday.
So we looking forward to your introduction later.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, okay. 那么第2位的嘉宾呢，就是我们邀请到了我们中国的校友代表陈赫然。那他呢会以一位文学爱好者的身份呢，向我们介绍他对于爱尔兰文学以及呢乔伊斯作品的一个解读。Hello， 赫然，可以跟大家打一个招呼吗
？Hello。
好的，那接下来待会儿呢就等待你的这个分享。那同时呢，我们今天这个活动呢也是非常特别的，在我们前2天的这个推送中，相信大家也看到了，我们今年的 UCD Festival 的活动呢，是我们都柏林大学和我们杭州尤利西斯书店联名的这么一个活动。那今天呢也非常欢迎现在身在杭州参加今天布鲁姆日的各位书迷朋友们。Hello， 大家好，希望今天晚上大家都能够 enjoy 这个活动。那好，今天的整个活动呢将会持续大约是1个小时的时间。那么呢，前面的这个部分呢，将会是由2位嘉宾呢来为我们介绍他们各自对于尤利西斯这个作品的一个解读。那因为经常我们会称尤利西斯为一个非常难懂的这个天书，所以呢，今天也请到了2位来给我们做一个介绍。那最后呢，在这2个嘉宾的介绍之后呢，是我们的一个现场的问答互动环节，以及呢一个趣味的问答的这么一个环节最后是2个问答的这个部分。那参与今天的这个问答部分呢，我们是有这个节日限定的这个礼品掉落的。那今天的这个礼品的话呢，将会是由我们都柏林大学以及我们杭州尤利西斯书店提供的这个限定的这个周边，一个呢是我们的书签，另外一个呢是尤利西斯的这个徽章。所以呢，大家呢一定要积极参与我们最后的这个互动，赢得这个限定的礼品。那接下来的话呢，我就会把话筒交给赫然，那由他呢以一个文学爱好者的这个身份来为大家呢介绍一下他本人对于爱尔兰文学还有对于詹姆斯·乔伊斯作品的一个解读。Hello， 赫然，接下来我就把话筒交给你了。
好的，谢谢杰的介绍。大家晚上好，我叫陈赫然，是 UCD 2013届 Smurfit 商学院供应链管理专业的毕业生。今天非常荣幸受邀参加 UCD Festival 这场重要的活动。作为一名普通的校友，也作为一名业余文学爱好者，来蹭一下 UCD 最著名校友 James Joyce 的热度。接下来呢，我将和大家分享2段和爱尔兰文学有关的2段我的小经历。 第一段呢是关于爱尔兰剧作家塞缪尔·贝克特的荒诞派戏剧《等待戈多》。这部剧呢是于1953年在法国首演的。我在 UCD 读书的时候，曾经去法国图卢兹高等商学院交换了1学期。当时周围的同学全是法国同学，虽然是英语授课，但是他们的英语普遍不是很好。课上的小组讨论，甚至还有部分问题或者老师的回答都是用法语进行。很遗憾的是，我并不懂法语。刚开始的小组讨论，组员们还尝试着用碎片化的英语跟我讨论，但表达的很艰难，讨论时间又非常有限。于是就演化成了小组的另外5个人用法语先交流，得出结论后再派个代表跟我说。这样的话，其实对我还有小组项目作业的这个参与度就大打折扣，让我很着急。于是为了能融入进去呢，在讨论项目之余，或者是吃饭闲聊的时候，我都会努力去找一些话题，让他们用英语跟我聊起来。虽然法国离爱尔兰不是很远，但他们大部分没有去过爱尔兰，有点好奇。所以说我就会经常跟他们聊一些爱尔兰的风土人情，包括 UCD Orientation Week 的各种活动。那么因为我是从爱尔兰交换过去的，天天又都跟他们聊这些，于是这帮法国同学们似乎就默认我是个爱尔兰通。有一天我小组有个同学说他参加了戏剧社，然后突然问我说有没有读过《等待戈多》。这个我还真读过，大学修了课，考试还考过呢。他说他们要排个话剧，但是台词反反复复，混乱又难记，让他很头疼。他说的没错，确实是这样。但是呢，等待戈多整体的逻辑是清晰的，可以拆分再拆分，小的板块就靠双方互相引导来说下去。我就按照自己的理解来这么跟他说着，没想到对方一下子就打开了话匣子，还用英语磕磕巴巴的跟我讨论了起来。有的地方我们都不太清楚的，甚至还像猜谜一样，你一言我一语的描述起了细节，还比划起来了。他甚至还拉起了旁边的同学当外援。就这么连环一问啊，围来了好多人，七嘴八舌的，特别热闹。那其实这个中午是非常简单的一个中午，但这个中午带来的呢，不只是我和周围同学的一时热络。从当天下午的小组讨论开始，我的组员们就开始用英语跟我讨论了。虽然说还挺吃力的，但是你一词我一句的就相互补充着，让我特别感动。其实这个中午到底也说不清楚到底发生了什么，但是我想肯定是发生了改变。这个呢，就是等待戈多为我带来的一个融入的一个小故事。那么第二段经历呢，我想分享的是关于尤利西斯和布鲁姆日。我刚来都柏林的时候，去 O'Connor Street 逛街，看见了一个雕塑，然后就上前跑去看看，发现原来是乔伊斯。接着似乎无论到哪儿都能遇到他，在 St. Stephen Green Park 晒太阳也能看到他，去 UCD 的图书馆一抬头 James Joyce Library。 这让我意识到呢，有乔伊斯之于都柏林似乎就像是高迪之于巴塞罗那。那我和本地同学聊起乔伊斯来，几乎是人人都知道他。有个参加读书会的同学还给我推荐了 James Joyce Center 还有 Joyce Tower， 说都是很具有代表性的景点。但有意思的是，读过乔伊斯的同学似乎没有几个，都说太难懂了，全是对话。今天呢是 Bloomsday， 这是除了 St. Patrick Day 以外，爱尔兰贡献的另外一个世界性的节日。这可以说是 James Joyce 通过写作尤利西斯创造的神话。他用一部小说创造了一个世界性的节日。那这个节日在我看来可以说是既大众又小众。说它大众呢，是因为这是个世界性的节日。每当 Bloomsday 来临，来自全世界的旅行者都会涌向都柏林，来这儿打卡，来这儿朝圣，来体验书中都柏林人一天的生活。那为什么又说它小众呢？因为关于这个节日，我问了很多人，老师、同学，有政府官员、公司职员、商店店员，大部分人虽然知道，但是都没有参加过。问起原因呢，有的说这个活动参加的都是文化人，文人喜欢这个。那么关于这一点呢，我问了 James Joyce 工作人员， James Joyce Center 的工作人员，他们给出的回答呢是很相似的，说参加活动的是很多，但是绝大部分都是尤利西斯或者乔伊斯的粉丝或者文学爱好者，圈外人不多。听到这是不是会觉得这果然是个有门槛的书，是个有门槛的活动？那么听我接着往下讲。那这个 James Joyce Center 呢，是位于都柏林市中心的一条比较安静的大街上，然后门牌也不是很明显，不是特别好找。我在去问路的时候碰到了去打卡的中国游客，便和他们结伴一起找了过去。快分别的时候呢，听他们兴致勃勃地跟我说起来即将去打卡尤利西斯第8章中的 David Byrne Pub， 我还以为他们是专家或者粉丝呢。结果细问下来呢，其实只是普通的游客，之前都没有读过尤利西斯，在做旅行计划的时候了解到了这个路线，于是呢就想以这样一种既地道又特别的方式来游玩和记住都柏林，结果反而是为了了解这个路线去看起了书，虽然当然只是为了找足迹的那种略读。他们的话呢，让我心中尤利西斯的阅读门槛一下子就降了下去。一直以来就是在挑战阅读尤利西斯时，屡败屡战，然后为了不破坏作者巧妙设置的结构呢，我每次都是从头开始，然后就像背单词一样，久久的走不出 abandon。那听了他们的话，我会忽然觉得，就原来你读书是不需要从头读到尾，甚至也不需要读懂，仅仅是摘读，或者是仅仅喜欢上了一句话，或者只是对足迹打卡的参与，其实也是一件非常有趣味的事。谁说读一本书一定要把它透彻的读懂呢？就像是喜欢一首歌，也不一定要听整首或者全会唱，其实有那么1、2句喜欢的哼一哼，也并不减少带来的愉悦。那有了这个想法之后呢，我改变了自己的读法，直奔我感兴趣的部分开始阅读，从这一段的阅读中发现缺失的信息，产生好奇，然后再去找，再去读。当然，虽然这只是个开始，但我感觉起码是真的开始了。那么以上呢，就是我分享的自己关于阅读爱尔兰文学作品以及他们发生在我生活中的2段小经历。感谢大家的聆听。那么我现在把屏幕还回给
Jay。Hello， 赫然，非常感谢你的这个分享啊。我也比较惭愧啊，身为这个 UCD 的这个校友，然后呢，也在都柏林呢生活过几年，但是其实好像生活在都柏林的时候呢，反而没有那么关注这个布鲁姆日。我觉得下次如果我再有机会能够回到都柏林的话呢，我一定会去按照这个我们的这个尤利西斯里面的路线呢，去打卡一下这个都柏林的各个地点的。下次希望能够和你一起回到这个都柏林去，
希望能尽快有这个机会，
对，重走一下这个尤利西斯的这个地点。那么接下来的话呢，我们就让我们有请我们今天的这个分享嘉宾，来为我们呢带来这个解读尤利西斯。那今天呢也是我们的重头戏。So, hi, Robert.
Hello.
So I will hand over to you.
It is over to me, is it?
Yeah. Can't wait to hear your sharing.
Hello to everybody in China. I want to welcome all of you here today on what is probably the most significant date in English literature, June 16th, the day on which most of the action in James Joyce's Ulysses takes place. Now, the main character in Ulysses is a Dublin man by the name of Leopold Bloom. So this day is also known throughout the entire world, and I presume in China as well, as Bloomsday. And we in Ireland are very proud to have James Joyce as one of our native sons, and we celebrate Bloomsday in great style every year. Now, maybe there's a little bit too much drinking involved sometimes, but well, we won't talk about that. Do you know, it took Joyce 7 years to write Ulysses. 7 years. Now, that's a long time. And therefore, under normal circumstances, well, I suppose you'd expect the novel to be a long, rambling book about extraordinary characters, heroic deeds, plots and subplots, probably spanning years, decades, maybe even centuries. Something like, I'm sure you're familiar with books like War and Peace or Don Quixote or Moby Dick or other books like that. Well, Ulysses is not like that at all. Actually, there's nothing particularly special about any of its characters, and nothing particularly dramatic or sensational happens anywhere in the novel. Believe it or not, all of the action in the book takes place within a period of about 19 hours, between about 8 o'clock in the morning on June 16th, 1904, and 2:30 a.m. the following morning on June 17th. Now, that's not even 24 hours. And within those 19 hours, Joyce manages to produce a novel of 732 pages with almost about 270,000 words. And on top of that, he managed to create a novel that is regarded as one of the greatest novels ever written in modern English literature. So, as I said, Ulysses is just about ordinary people going about their ordinary everyday lives on a very ordinary day when nothing of any real importance happens. And then, therefore, understandably, the storyline in the book isn't that important. What is most important is Joyce's description and creation of the characters in Ulysses. Now, like, of course, loads of small things do go on throughout the day in Ulysses, but as I said, the storyline itself is not that important. So I'm going to tell you now, very briefly, the main story in Ulysses. The main character, Leopold Bloom, is a Dublin man. Now, his wife, Molly, is having a bit of a love affair with a local businessman. And Mr. Bloom knows that he'll be calling in the afternoon to have a little, how will I describe it? I'll have a little bit of fun with Molly, if you follow my meaning. Now, Mr. Bloom is resigned to this arrangement because he hasn't made love to Molly for over 11 years, not since their baby son Rudy died at just 11 days old. So Mr. Bloom heads out for the day, knowing that he can't come home until later that evening, because if he comes home too early, he might, he might interrupt something. Now, on the other side of Dublin, you have another character of the book, a 22-year-old young Dublin man by the name of Stephen Dedalus. Now, he doesn't live in the family home for a whole load of different reasons. And he's staying with a friend of his. And they have a row. And he decides that he's not going to stay with his friend anymore. So he heads out for the day into Dublin City, not knowing where he's going to sleep that night. So on the one hand, you have Leopold Bloom, a man in search of the son that he never had. And on the other hand, you have Stephen Dedalus, a son in search of a father that he could respect. Well, eventually, Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus finally do meet up in the book. But I'm afraid you'll have to read Ulysses to find out what happens after that. So, well, there you have it, really. It's all pretty simple and straightforward. Now, one of the sad things about Ulysses, I suppose, is that James Joyce really believed that most people throughout the world would be eager to read his great novel. Everyone, from every walk of life, from every social standing, even from every level of education and from every corner of the world, including China, would be queuing up to get a copy of Ulysses. And unfortunately, I have to say that he got that spectacularly wrong. The reality is that most people struggle to get through about 30 pages before they abandon it. So when you take 30 pages, and I suppose, well, the first edition was 732 pages, that represents only about 4% of the book. So Joyce unfortunately completely failed in his ambition to have everybody reading Ulysses, and he was very, very disappointed about that. But there is also another very interesting thing about Ulysses. Apart from the fact that he wanted everybody to read the book, he is also quoted as saying to a friend of his, "I've put so many enigmas and puzzles into it that it will keep the professors busy for centuries, arguing over what I meant." And oh, how right he was. So, well, where does that leave us with Ulysses? Well, it kind of appears that we're looking to a certain extent at, well, not almost two books in one. Firstly, you have the idea of Ulysses as just an ordinary novel, well, a complex novel, but nevertheless, a work of fiction that's there to entertain you. But secondly, you have a novel that's full of symbols and mysteries and puzzles and cross-references and all sorts of stuff. Now, that is the Ulysses that you have to study in detail, where you spend long periods of time investigating the text, the symbols, and expanding the motives of the various characters by analysing their very thought and word. So if you want to approach Ulysses in that way, there are many, many books out there to guide you and to keep you busy, as Joyce said, for centuries. Now, I'm here today to introduce you to Ulysses as a regular novel. Well, as near as you can get to a regular novel. Basically a novel which most ordinary people should be able to pick up and read. Almost just like, well, say Agatha Christie or George Orwell or Stephen King or even Charles Dickens, that type of novel. Because, well, like most novels, the majority of people who pick up Ulysses just want to read it, to understand it, and most importantly, to enjoy it. And also, there's a huge level of curiosity around Ulysses. Why is it considered to be one of the greatest novels ever written? Why was it so controversial when it was first published? And why does it appear so difficult to read? Now, I've spoken to many, many people about Ulysses over the last 40 years or so, I'd say, and all I hear over and over again is, well, I've tried to read Ulysses. I got into about 30 pages and I had no idea what was going on or who was doing or saying what. I was completely lost. So why is it so complicated and difficult? And particularly when you think of it, in the first 30 pages or so, where most people end up getting lost, there are really only 4 characters. I mean, it should be particularly simple. So where is the problem? Okay, there are several aspects of Ulysses which can be challenging for readers, and particularly when Joyce starts to change his writing style later on in the novel. But that doesn't happen until you're at least halfway through it. So in my opinion, the main challenge, and it comes right from page 1, is Joyce's introduction of a writing technique known as the stream of consciousness. And it's also known as the internal monologue. Now, these are very big words, but what do they mean? What are streams of consciousness? Well, it's very simple. They're just our thoughts. Nothing more, nothing less. Just your thoughts. And when Joyce wrote Ulysses, he included the usual narrative and dialogue, as every writer does, but he also included the innermost thoughts of some of the characters as they moved through their day. And he did it in the exact way that people, and that includes you and I, usually think. This is one of the unique aspects of Ulysses, and also one of the greatest challenges. So, well, before we go any further, we need to think about our thoughts for a moment. And this is very, very important, because if we don't recognize how our thought process works, we'll never appreciate and understand just how Joyce developed and used the process so very well. Now, we as human beings are thinking all the time during our waking lives. Every second of every day, there are thoughts running around in here. And when you come to think of it, very few of our thoughts are what you might call kind of structured. Most of the time, they're instantaneous, and they don't come along neatly arranged in proper sentences with proper grammar and a beginning and an end. No, most of the time, they just flash into our heads out of nowhere and are gone in an instant. I suppose I'll just give one little example of how the kind of thought process works in humans. Suppose you're walking along the street heading for the bus stop, and you're running a bit late, and you're thinking to yourself, God, I hope I don't miss the bus today. And as you hurry along, thinking all the time about catching the bus, you notice that one of the front gardens which you pass by is not very tidy and, say, is in a bit of a mess. Then a sudden thought flashes through your mind. God, I must ring my mother and give her a call to see how she is. And although you probably mightn't even realize it yourself, the reason in this case, the example I'm giving, that thought came into your head might be just because a couple of weeks ago you had promised your mother that you'd call to her and tidy up her garden. And of course, you probably hadn't got around to it. So just as quickly as that thought comes into your head about phoning your mother, it disappears. And you probably start worrying again about missing that bus. This is one of the ways of how our streams of consciousness work. Totally random. We all have hundreds of them every day, maybe even thousands, who knows? But also, streams of consciousness, your thoughts, can be very much more structured and complex. You might be giving a lot of thought sometimes to how you're going to ask your boss for a raise in salary, or where you're going to go on your holidays this year, or what would you do with all the money if you happen to win the lotto? Now, these type of streams of consciousness are not instantaneous like a lot of other ones, and they'd probably be making a lot of sense to a stranger if they could get into your head at that moment. And finally, the other stream of consciousness is daydreaming. We spend a lot of our time just daydreaming in another world, as they say, with our heads in the clouds. In fact, probably some of you watching this presentation are daydreaming as I speak. Now, I'm not upset or insulted by that because, well, you can't help it. We go to the cinema, we go to the theatre, we're on a bus, or even, God forbid, we're at a lecture. And we just start to daydream sometimes. We fall into a little world of our own, maybe just for a couple of seconds, or maybe even a bit longer. So everybody experiences these streams of consciousness all the time, whether we like it or not. Now, I spent a good bit of time talking to you about our thought process. And well, I'm sure that there are some of you out there thinking, I came into this Zoom call because I wanted to hear all about Ulysses, and all I'm getting from this bloke is a psychology lecture. I'm wasting my time here. But you're not. You see, understanding our thought process is the fundamental key to understanding Ulysses, because Joyce expressed the thoughts of the main characters in Ulysses in exactly the same way as the human thought process works, as I've just been explaining to you. And I can now hear some of you saying, but in every novel, writers have to deal with the thoughts of the characters. So what's so different about Ulysses? And this is it. Because most writers normally let you know very clearly when one of the novel's characters is having a thought or a stream of consciousness. And there'll be something in the book like, quote, John, or whoever the character is, was thinking about this, that, or the other, or a thought suddenly came into John's mind, or, well, stuff kind of like that. So in most novels, you're always told when a character is thinking and also very clearly what they are thinking. And these characters' thoughts are almost always relevant to the story or the plot of the novel. And they're usually related to what's going on in the story at that particular moment. So it's all very clear, well-defined, and you can read along without a bother, fully aware when a character is talking, when they're thinking, and when there's narrative. Because in most novels, the story or plot, as I said, is the most important part, and the characters act and react in relation to the plot. But in Ulysses, the characters are the most important, and the storyline revolves around the characters. So Joyce presents the main characters to us in great detail through their conversations, their actions, and in particular, through their thoughts. And Joyce throws these streams of consciousness into the book at the very moment they occur in the character's head, just as it happens in real life. Anything from a fleeting thought to a long-winded ramble, in the middle of narrative, in the middle of dialogue, and without any warning. And if that's not enough, half the time, these streams of consciousness bear little or no relationship to whatever's going on in the particular scene in Ulysses. So you as a reader have to try to recognize the streams of consciousness for yourself with no help at all from Joyce. And as you read Ulysses, you have to separate the character's thoughts from the narrative and dialogue in order to make sense of what's going on. Because this is one of the biggest challenges throughout Ulysses. There is no special punctuation to let you know that you've just fallen into one of the characters' heads. There is no indication at all whatsoever. There is nothing. And this is where most people fall down with Ulysses, because, well, you're not expecting this. Nobody has kind of warned you about it. And, you know, what usually happens with Ulysses, and I've heard this so often, is that you're reading along the first page of Ulysses, and it's a nice piece of regular, straightforward narrative and dialogue, and everything is making complete sense to you. And you probably start thinking to yourself, I don't know what everybody's going on about. This is pretty straightforward. And then suddenly, out of the blue, you find that you're reading a word that doesn't make any sense to you and doesn't appear to have any relevance to the sentences around it. So, like most people, you start looking back over the last few paragraphs and thinking to yourself, God, I must have missed something. But when you go back up the page a bit, you don't find any clues. And you read the word again, and it still doesn't make any sense to you. So you probably read on, hoping that Joyce will make it clear at some stage what's going on. But I can tell you straight out here, he does not. And when you continue to read on, and it happens again and again and again, on every page there are words and sentences that don't really follow the text and don't make any sense to you. And you're desperately trying to work out just what is going on. And when this continues to go on like that, page after page, there is every chance that you throw the book aside thinking, they were right. Ulysses is impossible. I'm only 30 pages into the book and I've another 700 to go. And already I've no idea what's going on or who's doing what. And to me, that's the reason why Ulysses ends up on so many bookshelves around the world, never having been read. Now, these streams of consciousness are all over the place in Ulysses, and you need to be able to recognize them when they come up in order to understand and enjoy the book. But as I said earlier, the real problem in Ulysses is that in most editions from the very first publication in 1922 up to today, you'll find that there's no indicator of any kind on the page to let you know that you've just entered one of the character's streams of consciousness. Well, I'll put another example. It's a bit like, suppose you take your regular novel Charles Dickens or Douglas Adams or Margaret Atwood or anybody. And suppose these writers decided not to put any quotation marks for the dialogue in the book, you know, when characters are speaking. Now, it would make it pretty difficult to read it, wouldn't it? I mean, every time you came across a new paragraph, you'd have to, well, almost examine some of the words to work out whether they were narrative or dialogue. And a lot of the time, it just mightn't be that clear. So let's go a little further. Let's suppose that the dialogue and narrative were put into the same paragraph. It would start to become very, very difficult indeed. I mean, even simple children's books, like something like The Wind in the Willows, would become a bit of a challenge to read under those circumstances. And there's every chance that you would just put those books aside in frustration. But this is exactly what Joyce did with his characters' streams of consciousness. You never automatically know when you're inside a character's head, and you have to read very slowly and concentrate an awful lot to get through it. And I have to be honest with you. I think that Joyce didn't do any favors for his readers. He wanted everybody to read Ulysses, there's no doubt about that. But he made it very difficult. And over the years, I've heard some people say things like, well, if you want to read and understand Ulysses, you have to go through the pain. Well, now, between you and me, I think that's a load of rubbish. You should never have to go through pain to experience and appreciate any work of art. And Ulysses is certainly a work of literary art. Now, I'll be telling you how to get over this problem in a few minutes, but first, another thing that you have to keep in mind is when you're reading Ulysses, and even when you realize that, well, you're inside one of the characters' heads, you now have to accept that you're not always going to understand every bit of what they're thinking. But as I said earlier, as a lot of these streams of consciousness are merely random, sudden thoughts, as I explained, well, it's actually not that important. It's not going to affect your ability to follow the storyline. Besides, you know, I believe that it was Joyce's intention that, well, you wouldn't understand every reference in the streams of consciousness. I think when you're inside one of the characters' minds in Ulysses, you should consider yourself as what we call in Ireland a gate crasher, a sort of uninvited guest. The characters themselves are certainly not going to explain their thoughts to you. Sure, they don't even know you're there. And Joyce isn't going to help you out either. So my feeling is that Joyce's attitude to the readers when they came to streams of consciousness was, listen, I'm letting you inside their heads, but when you're in there, you're on your own. So don't worry if you don't understand everything in the streams of consciousness, because you're not actually supposed to. And this is particularly relevant at the beginning of Ulysses, or to be more specific, in the first 3 episodes of Ulysses, which is about 40 pages. Because the main character in these 3 episodes is a young man called Stephen Dedalus, as I told you earlier. Stephen, who is based actually on James Joyce himself when he was aged around 22, is an intellectual, an academic thinker, a bit of a philosopher. So most of what goes on in his head, his streams of consciousness, and there are many, many of them. Most of them, well, they're references to classical stories and classical writings and classical theories. So unless you're the same type of person, and I can tell you, I most definitely am not, you'll find that you won't understand an awful lot of what Stephen is thinking about. But don't worry about it. It doesn't affect the story. So just read it and move on. So when you've worked out at least how to recognize the streams of consciousness. Even if you don't understand some of them, you're well on the way to enjoying Ulysses. You end up getting deeper into the characters of Ulysses than you would in any other novel. You really feel that you've gotten to know them almost personally. So, well, after all of that, and I hope that made sense to you, I want to give you my opinion on what's the best way for you to understand this extraordinary novel and not get completely lost in the first 30 or 40 pages. Now, to me, there are 4 different ways that you can approach Ulysses. Firstly, you can pick up a copy of the book printed in very much the same format as the first one, published in 1922, with the same kind of page setups and punctuation, etc., and start reading it like you would any novel. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of editions of Ulysses printed and available in that way. I'm only showing you 3 of them, but there's hundreds of them. And up to recently, that was the only way you could buy it. But the problem is, from page 1, you start to have to break up each sentence or paragraph to distinguish between the streams of consciousness, which, as you know, appear out of the blue everywhere, and the rest of the book. This will take a lot of effort, and you end up kind of studying Ulysses as opposed to reading it like a regular novel. And you might just end up throwing it aside. Now, second way to read it is that you could pick up a copy of, well, my book, which is entitled Ulysses Remastered, and you can read that. Where is it? Here it is. Now, so what is so different about my book? Well, what I've done is quite simple. Well, no, it wasn't simple, but it was very straightforward. The 2 main things I did in this book were, firstly, I took all the streams of consciousness and put them into italics. So as you're reading along, you instantly recognize them straight away and know you've just fallen or jumped into somebody's head. And I've also put in regular inverted commas for the dialogue, which Joyce didn't do in the original versions of Ulysses. But just to mention now, everything else was left in the order and sequence in which Joyce wrote it. I didn't change a single word of what Joyce wrote or a sequence in what he wrote at all. All I really did was just make it visually easier to read. And I did all of this just to help the reader navigate through the wonderful writing of Joyce and avoid unnecessary confusion. Now, I don't think that book is available in the bookshops in China, unfortunately, but it is available, I think, online and also on Amazon Kindle, but that's enough about that. Now, the third way to approach Ulysses is to pick up any edition of Ulysses, either mine or any other edition that I showed you earlier, and read it in conjunction with the RTE radio recording of Ulysses, which was first broadcast in Ireland in 1982. RTE, as some of you will know, is our national broadcasting service. And they produced a dramatized version of Ulysses to celebrate the centenary of Joyce's birth, which was, of course, February the 2nd, 1882, and it was February the 2nd, 1982. Now, they didn't adapt it or change a single word, just like myself. They just dramatized exactly what Joyce had written. The whole thing is about 36 hours long. And as far as I'm concerned, I think they did a brilliant job with it. So you can listen to this wonderful RTE production for free on iTunes, on Spotify, and also on the RTE website itself. And I'll be giving various links to Gia, and I'm sure that she'll pass them on to you about how to get into these things, because it's beautiful to know that it now costs nothing to listen to it. You can also buy the full CD set. I don't know, there's 18 or 19 CDs in it. And I think that's around €50 or so, but you can buy it if you really, really wanted to keep it. So by listening to this wonderful recording, either before or after you've read each episode of Ulysses. It will really help you to work out what's happening, particularly in the episodes where there's a lot of streams of consciousness. And then maybe when you've read the book that way, you might decide later on to take up Ulysses again and just read it straight through on your own, because you will have such a good idea of it. Now, the fourth and last way you can approach Ulysses is you can join an online course on how to read Ulysses and read the book as the course progresses. Now, there are all sorts of courses, I believe, available on the internet. And one of them is, I know, regularly run by the James Joyce Centre in Dublin, which some of you will be aware. So whichever way you decide to read Ulysses, I would definitely recommend that you have a book of reading guidelines by your side at all times. You'll find it extremely helpful, particularly when you come to some of Joyce's unusual styles as you read further into the novel. Now, there are dozens of reading guideline books available, and, well, you might need to kind of browse through them in the bookshop or on the internet to find out which one might suit you the best. And, well, actually, several of the ordinary editions of the Ulysses book, including my own, have reading guidelines included at the back of the book. So that might be a cheaper and more convenient way for you to go about it. So as we're coming towards the end of this little talk, I'd just like to let you know what I think, having read the book many, many times, what I think is one of the most important themes and, I suppose, messages in Ulysses. Ulysses has shown to me just how varied and interesting life can be every single day. I mean, it's fairly understandable for most of us to think now and again that we're leading very ordinary lives. Sometimes you might even think they're even boring or, God forbid, but pointless at times. After all, none of us are celebrities. I mean, we don't hold high public office. We don't own yachts on the Mediterranean or big mansions all over the world. And we don't have a string of Ferraris in the garage. And we're never on television or in films. Or at least that's me. I'm not too sure about everybody else out there, but I would like to think probably that most of you are in the same boat as myself. But when we read Ulysses, we realize that our so-called ordinary, unexciting daily lives are filled with love, sorrow, regrets, sadness, happiness, dreams, decisions, relationships, observations, and all of the rest every day of our lives. Joyce was able to write a 700-page novel about ordinary people living ordinary lives on a single day. And that same book could also be written about any single day in your life or in mine. We sometimes think our lives are dull and boring, as I said, that we really don't do anything, but we get up in the morning, we have breakfast, we go off to work or study, we have lunch, we meet people during the day maybe we buy something in a shop on the way home, we come home in the evening, we chat to family and friends, or look at our social media, we have something to eat, we watch television, or we read, or we go out to meet friends, or maybe even take part in some sport, and eventually we go to sleep. And all of that time during the day, we are thinking non-stop. So we have enough interesting things in any one day of our lives to fill a 700-page book. So the most important message I get from Ulysses, and I repeat this here, that every single day in your life and mine is important and interesting. And it is vital that you enjoy every second of it. And that is why Ulysses, in spite of its challenges, is such an extraordinary and inspiring novel to read. So, well, I'd like to thank you for your time today, and I really hope that you got some good beneficial information out of what I've said, and decide now, I'd have a go at reading Ulysses. So, and I'd like to take this opportunity to propose a toast on this Bloomsday to James Joyce and Ulysses. So I now wish you all a very happy Bloomsday. Thank you.
Hi, Robert. Thanks so much. Thanks for your lively introduction of the Ulysses. So now I have confidence to pick up my Ulysses and read it. Yeah, this is Chinese version, Ulysses. Also, we got a lot of version translation of Ulysses. Thanks for your introduction. So I think you have introduced 4 best way to read Ulysses, and also I got one. So I heard from someone else to introduce to me. So the best way to read Ulysses is read it loudly, read it aloud, so that you can fully understand Ulysses. Is that true?
Sorry, is that a question to me?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
No, I have one question.
Sorry. I have heard that said a lot of times all over the place, and no, I would disagree with that completely. There is one episode of Ulysses that I would suggest would sound brilliantly if you read it aloud, and that is the Sirens episode of Ulysses when Leopold Bloom is in the Ormond Hotel. But if people aren't familiar, that's fine. It's kind of written like a musical fugue, and it's just brilliantly done. No, I think people are mixing up Ulysses with Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake you must read out loud, because a lot of the words on their own don't make an awful lot of sense. So they just sound good. And in fact, in a letter that James Joyce wrote to his daughter Lucia, he said once in it that I'm not too sure really what all the words mean, but I've been told that they sound very good. So reading Ulysses out loud, no, I've thought about this a lot because I hear it a lot. I don't think it would make any difference whatsoever, you know. And you know, that's really but that is only my humble opinion on that. But I've given it a lot of thought. But if you ever try to tackle Finnegan's Wake, and I'll tell you, it's some tackle, you would need to read that out loud, definitely, to get something out of it, but not Ulysses.
Okay, sure. So, yeah. So now, let me check the chat box to see if there are any question for you. I think yeah, I can see many audience, so thanks for sharing. It's very encouraging introduction.
They're all very brainy people out there, Gia. They've no questions. They know it all.
I think I saw one at the very beginning.
Okay.
So
some people, while you're looking for that, I just mentioned, some people always wonder why the chapters in Ulysses are called episodes and not chapters, because always the reference is in a certain episode. There are 2 reasons for that. Well, first of all, each episode has a name, and that was given to the episodes by Joyce and was published first in 1931, that they had a name corresponding to an event in Homer's Odyssey. So it's much easier to say the Telemachus episode of Ulysses or the Sirens episode of Ulysses as opposed to the Telemachus chapter. And also, because Joyce changed his style so much, they weren't really like chapters, because if you take your normal novel, the chapters are only a split up of the novel. The novel has one style and it's really clear and it's very good, and it's just that the chapters break it up. Whereas Ulysses, so many of the episodes are written so differently. They're almost like little individual books of their own, some of them. And that is why that's why they're called episodes as opposed to chapters, because people often ask that question. It doesn't matter if you call them chapters, but you'll hear most people say in the episodes of Ulysses. That's why.
Okay, sure. So I can see one question from Alice. Maybe she wants to know what is the gist of the book and what are the key takeaways. I think mean legacy for us after 1 century. So, and also, how do you see Dublin has changed?
Could you give me that question again, or could you bring it up on the screen? I wonder, because I missed some of what you were saying there.
Okay, I send you separately, send you the question. Yes, such a long
I think
question.
Part of it, if I remember, part of the question is to what what is the gist of the book in 3 sentences? Now, I couldn't do it in 3 sentences, I think, at all. I wouldn't even try to do it. I mean, and also I think the remainder of the question, which I couldn't see quite well, is what changes would there be in human society, particularly in Dublin and in Ireland after 100 years? I kind of have to say, to a certain extent, not a huge number of changes. What Joyce did in Ulysses, which made it so funny, it's a really, really funny book, really funny. What Joyce did is he had his tongue in his cheek, and I'm not too sure if you understand what that means over in China, but he was kind of smirking and smiling to himself all the time while he was writing Ulysses, and he was laughing to himself. In fact, Nora Barnacle, his wife and his partner at the time he was writing Ulysses, used to complain that Joyce used to keep her awake at night, laughing his head off as he was writing Ulysses, because what he was doing was he was poking fun at all of the what we call sacred cows in Ireland. I'm not too sure if you understand what that means. All of the most important reverenced items that we have, the religion, the state, and all of this, and they were most respectable of it in Ireland, and particularly other writers around that time, whereas Joyce kind of poked fun and made fun of it all, but he did it in such a way that you didn't really know he was poking fun until you were halfway through one of the episodes and you realize, hang on, Joyce isn't being serious here about this issue. So he did that. So he showed what Ireland was like in 1904. And I suppose, obviously, our tolerance of other religious people and people who are different to us has absolutely improved. It's improved all over the world, I think, since 1904. But a lot of people in Ulysses who have dealings with Leopold Bloom during the day, they don't regard him very well, and they kind of keep him apart. And a lot of people say it's because he has a Jewish background, and there are references to that in the book. But my genuine belief, and I see it happening today as well in Ireland, is because Leopold Bloom did not play the game everybody else was playing. In those days in Ulysses, every one of the men in the book were drinking basically all the money they had. And their lives revolved around the pub and drink. But Leopold Bloom's mind did not. He controlled it. He'd have a drink now and again, but he never, ever got into the state they did. And I think they resented him for that, more so than anything else. He wasn't part of their gang. He wasn't doing what they did and depending on drink all the time. So and I feel that a certain amount of that still exists in Ireland today. Very much so, and I've experienced it myself. I've seen it. I like to take a drink and that, but I've heard it about people I know who don't drink, that they're kind of regarded as different, you know. So I'm not too sure from that question, and I've gone around the world to answer it, if there are a hell of a lot of changes in Irish society, or particularly in Dublin society, since 1904.
Yeah, definitely same in China.
You know,
sure.
So well, there you are. But
yeah. So let me see. Is there any other question? Okay, so here's the second one. So I send it to you.
Yeah.
We can have it. Yeah. Let's see. Here.
I suppose reading serious literary.
Oh, sorry. I sent the wrong one.
Yeah. Which school in Ireland receives a visiting scholar? I've no idea. I've actually no idea of that. I've never come across that before, and I don't know. So I don't know that. And there's another one, that there are many gaps in Ulysses. There are a lot of gaps in Ulysses, but you must remember in Ulysses, well, first of all, if Joyce were to write the same detail in each of the episodes for events that happened, the book would be possibly about 2,000 or 3,000 pages long. So for his own reason, he made his decisions to skip things. And like that reader probably is aware, like Leopold Bloom going back into town after being in Glasnevin Cemetery, there's nothing about that. Leopold Bloom buying his newspaper. So although it goes through the very, very minute detail of a lot of what happens in these characters' minds and actions during the day, it's not every single thing they did every second, because the book would just, God, it'd be probably 3,000 or 4,000 pages long, the way Joyce wrote it. But Joyce also, as well, as I said in a little quote, he deliberately put in puzzles into the book that he doesn't answer, and just to keep the professors and the academics arguing over what he meant. And anybody who's read the book will know there's a graveyard scene, and there's a man there, the man in the Macintosh, as he's known as, and nobody seems to know who he is. But Joyce just threw him in there, and he doesn't come into the book again anywhere. And all the scholars are going around wondering who was the man in the Macintosh. And Joyce is just smiling to himself, saying, it's up to yourself. I'm not telling you. That's one of the puzzles. And there are loads more. So there will always be question marks. Another one right near the end, which really explodes a huge amount about the relationship between Leopold Bloom and his wife, Molly. Molly says in her thoughts towards the end, when we were engaged, he didn't know about my mother, or he wouldn't have got me as cheap as he did. That's just thrown in there, nothing else. And you're left wondering, what is this all about? And you just have to put it away saying, we're not meant to know this. This is just, again, we're in Molly's head. She's thinking about all sorts of things. And she's not going to explain what she means. Joyce isn't going to explain. So these are some of the streams of consciousness, as I said earlier, that we're not meant to really always understand. So that's why it's such a fascinating book. It's such a real depiction of the day in a life. So different to every other novel.
You suddenly see, so someone will, so take 700-page novel to describe one day life.
Oh, look.
Yeah.
It's just amazing. And it does make you think of just how important our lives are. We think we're just going about a humdrum, boring, normal life. But in fact, we are doing, thinking, talking, forming relationships, small or fast, every day with people. When you go into a shop, anything, you're forming a relationship for a few minutes or seconds with somebody, and you're moving on and you're thinking stuff. And it is quite exciting, probably maybe a lot more exciting than some of these celebrities who stay in front of the television and films all year round. I don't know. I'm not one of them, so I couldn't tell you.
Yeah. So
it is really good. It's amazing about Ulysses, because I've been involved in it so long, that a lot of people will read Ulysses and put it down, and that's fine, and they've read it and they're delighted to have read it. And unfortunately, a lot of people read it and don't understand it, but they read it because they're stubborn and they want to finish it, and they want to be able to say to their friends, I read Ulysses. But if Ulysses does get into you, it can actually get into you. Why, when I read it 17 or 18 years of age, am I still, at my very old age, still caught up with it, still wanting to read it again, still getting more out of it every time? It's just, he was a genius. And that's not a word that I use too often, because it does get thrown around a lot about people who are very talented. Oh, that guy's a genius, that guy's a genius. And they're not geniuses, they're just very talented. But when you get a genius, Mozart and music, you go, a genius, they're special. They're very, very special. And Joyce, to me, was a genius. And he could just, what he did with Ulysses was just incredible.
Yeah, it seems you are big fans of James Joyce.
And a lot of people are all over the world.
I think the audience joined today's webinar event. Some of them are Joyce fans. They love Ulysses. They love James Joyce. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Okay, so let I go through the question. Okay, I can see one.
I saw a question there about why did Stephen Dedalus not help his sisters, who were basically starving to death? And in fact, in Joyce's real life, that was the way his family was. They were in an awful position financially. And Well, again, because there's nothing said in the book exactly why, but I think it's pretty clear that Stephen was, as we say in Ireland, in denial. He had gone through a horrendous time in the house himself, where he saw the poverty all the time. He'd moved out of the house and he was staying, as I said, with a friend of his, and he had taken accommodation. He was renting a flat in Ballsbridge. He didn't want to have anything whatsoever to do with his family anymore. And he knew, he feared, and I think it comes in, actually it does come in one of his streams of consciousness. He's afraid that if he got any way involved again with his family, he'd get sucked in to their misery and poverty, which he had fought so hard to get out of. And he just decided he was going to do nothing about it and stay outside it. Besides, he didn't have an awful lot to his own name anyway. He had very little money or that, and he was doing a very, very small job and getting a very few shillings every month for doing it. So it wasn't a case of that he was wealthy or anything, but he just wanted to, and this is where, as I said earlier, he was basically in search of a father figure that he could look up to and respect, because he knew he could never respect his own father anymore for bringing the family into the state they were in. And I think that is the reason, but it's not dictated very clearly anywhere, so it's up to anyone to make their own decision on it. But I think that seems to be clear within the book, that that's what he was doing.
Yeah, I have sent you a new question.
Okay.
Yeah, have you seen that? It seems you want some recommendation of the author who are influenced by James Joyce.
I think almost every serious author in the English language has been influenced by James Joyce, and in particular Ulysses. I know, because I happen to be reading some of his books at the moment, George Orwell, famous author, as we all well know, and I'm reading through some of his things, and it's very obvious. In fact, it jumped out of the page at me as I was reading some of George Orwell. I think it was Down and Out in London in Paris was one of his books that I read recently, and it is so obvious in part of the style of some of that book that he was taking the style straight from Ulysses. And it's fine. I'm not criticizing that. He did that. There's almost every author who's written decent English literature have all admitted that they have been influenced by James Joyce's writing, because it's impossible not to be. He took the novel as it had been in Victorian time and pre-Victorian time and he completely ripped up the rule book completely. And he said, this is the way I want to write a novel, and you can write a novel any way you want. You don't have to stick to rules and regulations about the format of it or anything, or indeed the punctuation, as I was explaining. You can do it any way you want. And all the authors of the English language since then have taken that on board.
Yeah, and also I think the question keep going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've sent you a question, so raised by the audience in the Ulysses bookstore.
Sorry, is there a question there for me to reply to?
Yeah, I sent you a new question.
Yep. Nothing's coming up here on my screen, but what was it? You said there's a Ulysses bookstore. Now, there is a Ulysses bookstore in Dublin, which basically deals with all sorts of old and antiquated books, and they often have first editions of Beckett or William Butler Yeats, and also Ulysses as well. That's a beautiful little bookshop. The stuff, I'm afraid, is pretty expensive in there, but it's wonderful stuff, and I can see why. But I don't understand the question outside of that.
Okay, so I think Shuing here, they want to have a have a talk with you.
Yeah.
Hello.
Okay, so hello. I'm one of the employees of the Ulysses bookstore. So I will just briefly introduce our bookstore, and also we will express a great gratitude to Robert. Thank you for coming here and sharing your reading
You're welcome.
experience about how to understand and reading the Ulysses and James Joyce. And also I will introduce our bookstore. It's Ulysses bookstore is independent bookstore which promotes customers to reading the serious literacy works, and it's opened on November 6, 2020. And after a period of time, we only sold out Ulysses, and we numbered them each time we sold them. So currently, I believe we have sold out 425 Ulysses.
Wow.
And we numbered each one of them. You know,
Yeah.
there's a lot of people love James Joyce, and also Bloomsday, as known as a great as known as a very important day to the world literacy, and it is also a very important day to the bookstores. Last year we celebrated this Bloomsday as like through making a city roaming, just like Bloom in the Ulysses. And also sorry like so this year we celebrate this day with University College Dublin. Yeah, great pleasure. Okay, so we owe the debt of gratitude to Robert Gogan. Thank you for coming here and sharing us your great research achievement and experience. And also we express gratitude to UCD Chinese Center for giving us chance to make all this possible. And we also share to express our gratitude to Joyce. His works are the treasures of human civilization. So thanks for all people come here today, and happy Bloomsday. Thank you.
Thank you, Shu Ying. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, Robert, if you have a chance to come to China, definitely you can go to the Ulysses bookshop in Hangzhou City.
Yes,
Yeah.
I would love to do that.
Yeah.
I'd love to do that. And I'd love to have the time. It would be great, maybe some other time or whatever, to actually go through more detail of Ulysses, the various episodes, to help people through it. But I might be doing something on the internet about that at some stage, and I'll let you know, because I've given a very broad, in 35 or 40 minutes, it's very difficult to give anything other than a very, very broad outline of what Ulysses. But what I have brought in is the absolute kernel of the problem, the very center of the issue with Ulysses that people experience at the very beginning, the stream of consciousness and recognizing it. That's where the real problem starts.
So I think can do one last question.
Okay.
So yeah, this one is the question about the name of the character.
Yeah, well, Ulysses, yeah. Well, Ulysses, excuse me. Well, as you probably know, Joyce wanted to mirror his book with that of Homer's Odyssey.
Yeah.
Which is famously known. And like Homer's Odyssey is about the adventures of a character called Ulysses or Odysseus, and he was king of Ithaca, and he was wandering around the Mediterranean Sea trying to make his way home after the Trojan War and meeting all sorts of trouble and obstacles on the way. And the book is also about the adventures of his son Telemachus as he sets out in search of his father and is eventually united with him. So Joyce wanted to mirror his book with that. So in Joyce's Ulysses, you have our hero, Leopold Bloom. Now he's hankering after the son that he never had, and he's wandering around Dublin all day until he eventually ends up finding his substitute son, Telemachus, in the form of Stephen Dedalus, who himself is wandering around Dublin all day with no home to go to. So there is a parallel, but I would also like to mention here as well, because people often ask, oh, do I have to read Homer's Odyssey before I ever read Ulysses, or will I understand what's going on? And the very short answer to that is you never, ever have to read Homer's Odyssey if you want to read Ulysses. It will not make any difference to your understanding of Ulysses. It does, if you become one of these people who becomes deeply engrossed in Ulysses and want to go a little further with it and do a little study, it is interesting to read Homer's Odyssey, because you find certain things that happen in Ulysses that happened in the Odyssey, and that's why they happen. A very quick one, when Leopold Bloom is leaving Barney Kiernan's pub, somebody in the pub throws an empty biscuit tin at him. Well, in the corresponding episode of Homer's Odyssey, the Cyclops, the monster on the cliff, throws a big stone at Ulysses' ship and he misses it. And of course, the guy in Barney Kiernan's pub misses Leopold Bloom as well. So, you know, when you see this, you suddenly see, that's why that little bit is brought in, because it's in Homer's Odyssey as well. And so that's the kind of reason for that. So you don't have to read Homer's Odyssey before you read Ulysses. I'm glad that came up, because it's important for people to know. Homer's Odyssey is a beautiful book to read anyway. I've read it, but I mean, I had read Ulysses about a half a dozen times or more before, just purely out of curiosity. I decided I'll read Homer's Odyssey now because I know Ulysses so well, and it was fascinating to read. It was beautiful, and it enlightened Ulysses a little more for me, but it will not confuse anybody in the book if they don't know what's happening in Homer's Odyssey.
Yeah, I think Ulysses has spent 10 years adventure.
Oh, it's 9 years. Yeah, it is that. It's huge. And this is one of the big problems in Ulysses. I didn't have time to really go into it, because Telemachus, Ulysses' son, takes up the first 4 parts of Homer's Odyssey. So what James Joyce does is he puts Stephen Dedalus in the first 3 episodes of Ulysses. But unfortunately, as I said in my little talk, he is an intellectual and a very deep thinker, and he's thinking about Aristotle and all sorts of stuff all the time. And it turns so many readers off. And I wish I'd had an opportunity, excuse me, to meet with Joyce before he published Ulysses and say, listen, Jim, would you not think of putting Leopold Bloom first, so people can get to know a sort of regular person just in one episode, and they get into the stream of consciousness a bit easier before you give them Stephen Dedalus. And I know there was a course on Ulysses which went on in Dublin some time ago, and I don't know if it's still going or not, teaching people Ulysses. And what they do is they read the first episode, which is the Telemachus episode, when Stephen leaves where things happen and Stephen leaves the Martello Tower. But the next 2 episodes of Stephen's, they actually skip over and they go directly to Leopold Bloom, inviting the students to come back to the other 2, because episode 2 and 3 particularly are so difficult to understand that most people, as I've said, by the time they get to page 30 have thrown it down. And I don't think Joyce had thought this out clearly enough, what he was doing. And that's how he ended up being so disappointed when so many people just didn't read his book.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I think we have thought of most of the question here.
Right.
Yeah. And many our audience, they can't wait to start to read Ulysses.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that.
Yeah. As many audience today, yeah, we'll pick up the Ulysses.
Yeah, they need, and they need to know that it's going to be a little bit difficult in the first 3 episodes or chapters. It actually gets a little easier after that for a while when they meet Leopold Bloom, because he's great fun.
Okay, sure. So thank you. So we will go to the next section. Will be the quiz. So I I will introduce this part in Chinese. So,
No.
Yeah, sure. 好的，各位朋友们，终于到了我们今天的最后一个环节了，是非常有趣的一个趣味问答啊，一共是3个问题，那我们就以在这个聊天框里回答这个最快然后准确的一个答案，我们挑选其中的3位观众啊，来送出我们今天的限定奖品。我看到有非常多的朋友已经开始庆祝布鲁姆日，因为今天是布鲁姆日嘛，大家都经常是一个什么样的打扮？我看一下这个聊天框区域内哪位朋友是回答最快啊？我这里已经看到了是这位叫做 Crystal 的书迷。那好的，确实是这个 B 啊，我们的最经典的这个布鲁姆日的一个装扮这个非常典型的帽子，还有呢模仿那个James Joyce 的一个穿着。那可能还有不了解的朋友会选择其他的选项啊。那如果有选 A 的话，那告诉你这个是爱尔兰国庆日大家才会穿着的一个打扮，就是满身绿，是庆祝 St. Patrick Day 的一个穿着。然后呢 C 的这个选项的话呢是庆祝苏格兰的国庆日。那最后一个 D 的话呢也是一个爱尔兰的一个传统节日，一般呢是在这个丰收的时候的一个节日，我们叫它爱尔兰的一个大型的相亲节日。所以呢正确的答案是 B 庆祝布鲁姆日的一个装扮。那接下来是第2一个问题，也是跟我们的这个尤利西斯相关的。那因为尤利西斯呢是描写着这个主人公在都柏林1天的这个一个经历嘛，那在都柏林的哪个餐厅能够享受到尤利西斯主角的同款餐食？这个餐厅出现在过 James Joyce 的作品里面。那如果有了解的，我看一下聊天区里面是有谁答对了稍等一下。这个问题过得非常的快啊，我现在有点分不清楚哪一个是第2道题的啊。那好，我现在这里看到的最快回答对的应该是稍等一下，我再 check 一下啊。我看到了我们今天的嘉宾赫然回答对了这个问题，但是因为你今天是这个主持人，所以呢我需要把你剔除在这个获得奖品的这个名单里啊。那我们再挑选另外一位啊。我要把你排除出这个获奖名单里哈。我看一下，那应该是这一位 Alice 是回答对了哈。确实是第1个这个餐厅，也是在我们赫然的这个分享里面分享过的，在尤利西斯里面提到过的这个餐厅。这个餐厅呢在爱尔兰的这个历史非常的悠久啊，它开业于1798年，所以是一个历史非常悠久的餐厅。那剩下的这个选项 B、C、D 的话呢，也是都柏林城市里面非常值得打卡的3个餐厅。那如果大家呢有机会到这个都柏林，或者是呢如果你是今年的这个即将入读 UCD 的同学，来到都柏林之后呢，有机会可以去这3个餐厅打卡一下，都是非常不错的。那接下来是我们最后一个问题啦，是今天晚上最后能够获得奖品的机会了。那是跟我们都柏林大学相关的，在都柏林大学的哪一处能够打卡到 James Joyce 的这个雕像？好的，我看到已经有正确答案了，非常快。是这一位吧 ，Leslie 阮，这一位朋友答对了。不知道你是不是 UCD 的这个新生啊？你这么快能答对？确实在我们的这个都柏林校园里面是有 James Joyce 的这个雕像的。那它的位置呢，大概是在现在图片展示的这个位置，是在这个 Newman Building 的这个过道这里，你可以找到这个 James Joyce 的这个雕像。那希望呢，如果有今年入读的这个同学呢，在到了 UCD 校园之后呢，第一时间来打卡一下这个 James Joyce 的雕像。那以上的话呢，就是我们今天的这个趣味问答了。那获得这个趣味问答奖品的3位 我们的观众呢，分别是这个 Crystal， 第2位是这个 Alice M， 最后一位是这个 Leslie 阮。那麻烦你们呢，在活动结束之后呢，可以把你们的这个邮寄信息发送到我的这个邮箱，那附上你的这个 Zoom 的名称，还有你的详细的邮寄信息到我的邮箱里我们会在活动结束之后呢，为你邮寄这个我们的限定奖品，今天的这个布鲁姆日的一个限定礼品。那还有参与我们前面的一个关于尤利西斯互动现场互动问答的3位朋友的话呢，我们也会送出另外的一个奖品啊。那获得这个前面3个互动的奖品的也是第1位是 Alex M， 然后第2位是这个名字叫泰山，第3位也是这一位 Leslie 阮。那也是麻烦你们把你的信息还有这个地址发到这个邮箱里。那好的，各位朋友们，非常感谢大家呢，在今天晚上，在布鲁姆日的晚上呢，来参加我们 UCD Festival 的这个全球活动的收官之作。我们今年的这个理解尤利西斯的这个活动。那希望呢，今天大家呢能够有更深的了解到我们的校友 James Joyce。有呢更加深入的了解到尤利西斯这部非常伟大非常知名的这个作品。那希望大家呢在这个活动结束之后能够重新的拿起你的尤利西斯这本小说，那重新的来阅读它，那可能大家呢会有更多不一样的这个认识。那今天的活动的回放呢，将会在我们的 UCD Alumni 的 YouTube 频道呢放出我们今天活动的这个回放。如果呢你今天晚上有任何遗漏的这个部分，或者呢你想重温我们的嘉宾带来的这个尤利西斯的解读的话呢，欢迎大家呢到我们的 UCD Alumni 的 YouTube 频道呢去观看这个播放。那希望呢和各位相约我们下一年的 UCD Festival。那 UCD Festival 呢是一个1年1度我们 UCD 的这个盛典，每一年呢都会有不一样主题的这个全球性的活动，邀请呢我们位于全球的 UCD 的校友，我们 UCD 的学生，以及呢各位朋友们来加入我们的这个活动。所以非常感谢大家的这个参与。然后呢，我们也要非常感谢今天我们的2位嘉宾分别是我们的这个校友赫然，还有呢我们的这个作家 Robert Gogan 先生，今天晚上呢为大家带来的这个非常精彩的解读。那同样也要非常感谢今天呢在线下参加我们的这个活动的我们的书迷朋友们。那希望和大家呢下一年再见。Hi Robert, hi Haran. Thanks so much for your participation today. Thanks for your sharing.
Bye now, Gia. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you. See you.
See you.
Bye now. Bye.